Over the past century, many beautiful aircraft have graced the skies above Britain. The flying kites of Sopwith and Bristol, the sleek beauty of the Supermarine Spitfire, and the terrifying but awe-inspiring lines of the Vickers Vulcan. But there have also been an equal number of aircraft that didn't look quite as good, and that's the topic of today's video. Now, while these aircraft may represent some deeply disturbing visual horrors or questionable design decisions, they weren't all necessarily bad aircraft, I want to make that clear. Beauty did not guarantee success, nor did ugliness always lead to failure. So, with their effectiveness put aside, let's take a look at what I believe to be 10 of the ugliest planes built in the United Kingdom. Coming in at number 10 is this, the Vickers Vulcan. Designed at the start of the 1920s, the Vulcan was built as an 8-passenger airliner, one of the first of its kind, and at first glance it appeared that Vickers designers couldn't figure out if they were designing a plane or an airship. Originally, its design was based on the Vickers Vimy, but by the time the first Vulcan flew in 1922, there was little resemblance between them. Built for efficiency and reduced cost, it featured just one engine, and its two-blade propeller looked comically small in comparison. Nicknamed the Flying Pig for its looks, it quickly earned a reputation for being underpowered and unreliable, even after its 360 horsepower Rolls-Royce Eagle was replaced by a 450 horsepower Napier Lion. Despite numerous problems, this tubular aircraft was put on display at the 1925 Empire Exhibition at Wembley, ostensibly as a representative of Britain's progress in civil aviation, which no doubt did wonders for the morale of international competition. At number 9, we have an aircraft that's been featured on this channel before, the AD Scout. In the First World War, the British Admiralty became obsessed with creating the perfect wonder weapon for hunting down and destroying the Zeppelin menace. However, they also had limitations with budget and resources, so they drew up a requirement for an aircraft that could be made from so-called commercially available resources, and it was to be equipped with a quick-firing 40mm recoilless cannon. The end result was an aircraft so strange and flimsy in appearance that I suspect a medium-speed collision with a pigeon would have been enough to knock it out of the sky. The AD Scout looked about as stable as an intoxicated giraffe, and it flew about as badly as it looked. After its cancellation, its designer went to work for Blackburn, where he improved this design into what would become the equally unsightly Blackburn triplane. But this proved no more successful than the original, and the brave pilots of the Fleet Air Arm were spared the traumatic experience of ever seeing these things in numbers. Wading in at number 8 is an aircraft that was as ugly as it was successful, the Fairy Gannet. With a jet pipe sticking out the side like the siphon of an octopus, bent wings, contra-rotating propellers with a psychedelic yellow and black spinner, and often equipped with a radar that made it look like it was in its third trimester, the Gannet was the chunky darling of the Fleet Air Arm. The Gannet had a long and fascinating service life, operating for 25 years between 1953 and 1978. If looks could kill, it was certainly an effective weapon, but seeing as it could also carry 4 nuclear depth charges, it wouldn't matter if the Gannet looked like a swan or a swine. Its enemy was going to either be blinded by its looks or its payload. The Fairy Gannet was also an innovation, being the first turboprop aircraft to see carrier operations in the world, and its power plant system was remarkably practical and reliable. It featured not one, but 2 fuselage-mounted Armstrong-Siddeley Mamba engines. These drove 2 contra-rotating propellers, but each engine drove its own propeller independently. This allowed the Gannet to shut down one engine to enter a lower power, loitering mode for sub-hunting, and in the right conditions, this reduced its fuel consumption to just 1 pound of fuel for each mile covered. And so, despite looking like a plane that stayed too long at the all-you-can-eat buffet, it was remarkably frugal. Up next in 6th place, we have the Miles Aerovan. If the Oxford Dictionary had an aviation equivalent, then this aircraft would have appeared under the definition of the word rotund. This plump-looking thing was designed in 1944 as a twin-engine, short-range, low-cost transport. Affordability was a core aspect of its design, to both make it appealing as a wartime transport and as a peacetime transport during the expected economic austerity when the war had concluded. Unfortunately, its development was put on hold until after the war, as Miles had developed it privately, and the British Air Ministry took issue with this unauthorized use of materials. When the war was over, the predicted demand for the Aerovan immediately appeared, but because of the Air Ministry's ruling, Miles had been unable to prepare for this demand, and customer orders outstripped their ability to deliver. Despite this, the Aerovan proved incredibly popular, and it was used to transport everything from furniture to food to livestock. In one incident, an Aerovan was nearly brought down by its cargo of pigs, who, in a panic, began charging up and down the cargo hold when the aircraft was about halfway across the English Channel. The undulating motion caused by the rampaging porkies, combined with the large mess they made, resulted in the poor pilot being rather unwell when he finally managed to land. Ironically, the success of the Aerovan, an aircraft designed for cost-saving transportation, was curtailed with the bankruptcy of Miles in 1947. Coming in at number 5, we have what appears to be a hawker-siddeley Nimrod that lost a fight with a couple of bees. This is in fact the British aerospace Nimrod AEW3, which was a proposed airborne early warning aircraft from the 1980s that proved to be nothing but a cornucopia of problems. The Nimrod on its own had its fair share of issues as it was, and wasn't much of a looker either. And apparently, nobody stopped to question the idea of making a complex, unreliable airframe even more complex and unreliable, and making it even more ugly into the bargain, courtesy of a pair of complex radar systems. The complexity of the project was compounded by the fact that it was a joint venture between British Aerospace and GEC Marconi, who both had the wonderful tendency of blaming each other whenever something went wrong. The end result was an over-budget, overbuilt, comically bulbous aircraft whose computer memory was so small that it was sometimes full and had to be cleared before it had even left the runway. Ultimately, the project was cancelled, and the Avro Shackleton, which this failure was meant to replace, had to soldier on until the 1990s. In 4th place, just short of a podium finish, comes the Hanley Paige Hayford. Boy, this was an ugly biplane. Entering service in late 1933, early 1934, this jacked-up abomination was obsolete pretty much from day one. Despite this, it was still taking on in force, and 125 of these unflattering bombers were delivered. The unique placement of the fuselage, being attached to the upper wing rather than the lower, allowed ground crews to safely attach bombs even when the engines were running. It also meant that the pilot was a lofty 17 feet or 5 meters from the ground, which, while good for visibility, made landing a trickier affair. Designed for nighttime bombing and with a maximum speed of just 142 miles an hour, or 229 kilometers an hour, its service life was destined to be brief, and they were gradually phased out between 1937 and 1939. Though not kept on as a bomber, a few Hayfords saw service during the Second World War, either as test beds or as glider tugs. Some were actually used to test in-flight refueling. They were reportedly a constant cause for amusement amongst the younger RAF pilots, who wondered why Hanley Paige had built their old bomber upside down. Lumbering into 3rd place is the Blackburn R1 Blackburn, perhaps one of the ugliest things to ever spoil the deck of Her Majesty's aircraft carriers. Designed as a fleet spotting and reconnaissance aircraft, the Blackburn had a deep, slab-sided fuselage that was dictated by the dimensions of its large W12 Napier Lion engine. Function over form had been the mantra when designing this thing, and perhaps Blackburn had taken it too literally, as it had been originally so uncomfortable for its 3-man crew that numerous alterations had to be made during its development. Though it looked atrocious, the Blackburn did its job pretty well, serving for over 80 years and being built in fairly respectable numbers for its time. It even spawned a training variant, which was somehow even more ugly than the original, but by the early 1930s it was totally obsolete, and it was finally replaced with the much easier on the eyes Fairy Fox. Coming in second place is a product of the Cold War. In the 1950s and 60s, many aircraft were built around the delta wing principle, and many of these were sleek, elegant, and refined. The Hanley Paige 115 was none of these things. When viewed from the side, it looks like the placement of the engines and the cockpit was misaligned at some point during construction, as nothing properly lines up. But there was a reason behind this. It was a testbed to evaluate the handling of delta wing aircraft at low speeds and at a high angle of attack. This is why it is probably the only jet-powered delta wing aircraft to come with a fixed landing gear. Owing to the nature of its design, it was not expected to be particularly stable. As a result of this, the test pilots had to undergo a rigorous training program with a simulator before they were allowed to operate the actual aircraft. At one point, Neil Armstrong was scheduled to test fly it as part of an international cooperation program, but after his selection for the Apollo missions, NASA revoked his permission to fly the HP-115 from fear of losing him in an accident. He would eventually go on to fly it after he had been to the moon. Despite looking about as stable as British fiscal policy in the 1970s, the 115 enjoyed a relatively trouble-free life. It completed its test program in 1974 and is now on display at the Fleet Air Arm Museum, where it attempts to terrify the local visitors. Finally, in first place, we have something truly horrific. Ironically, it comes from a company that would give us some of the best looking aircraft ever made, but not this one. This was their first, their dark secret, their villain origin story, the skeleton in their closet. This was the Supermarine Nighthawk. Yes, I know it's terrible, even now I'm avoiding the urge to wash my eyes out with bleach, but there you have it. This was another product of the Admiralty's obsession with Zeppelin hunting. It was originally designed by the Pemberton Billing Company, but when its founder tired of aviation and moved into politics, the company was reformed as Supermarine. Completed in 1917, it was a swept-wing quadruplane that was apparently built to the principle of, if I don't believe in drag coefficient, it can't hurt me. Although it was claimed to have a top speed of 75 miles an hour, or 121 kilometers an hour, the prototype barely managed 60 miles an hour and took over an hour to reach 10,000 feet. Its failure as a potential Zeppelin hunter is further crystallized when it is considered that Zeppelins themselves could be capable of top speeds that match the Nighthawk, which would have made for the slowest aerial chase in history had they ever met in action. Had it managed to somehow intercept a Zeppelin, it would have brought to bear a 37mm recoilless Davis gun and a swivel-mounted Lewis machine gun. But it's probably a good thing this never happened, as the nature of the Davis gun limited its fire arc considerably, as you didn't really want the ejected shell case perforating your fuselage, and the unreliability of the Anzani engines that were meant to equip it made the advertised endurance of 9 hours seem more like a fantasy rather than an actual projection. Success or failure aside though, the Nighthawk was one ugly beast, and thankfully only one was ever built. And that rounds off my list of Britain's top 10 ugliest aircraft. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you of course to the patrons, with a special shout out to Kevin, Deliardo, Bain, FB, Christopher R, Tronathon, Eric Heineman, John Austin Jr., Ray Colata, Keith Terrier, Greensea Ships, Northlinks Web, MCT Ted Parsons, and Capitano Lorenzo, for their support as Wing Commander tier patrons. I hope you all enjoyed this slightly different format. If you did, look forward to more in the future. Until then, I'll catch you all next time.